June 28, 1914. Sarajevo, Bosnia. A Sunday morning. The streets are lined with flags. Crowds have gathered along the Appel Quay to catch a glimpse of something remarkable. The heir to one of the most powerful empires on earth come to walk among them. Children perch on their father's shoulders. Women press forward against the barriers. The air smells of summer and cigarette smoke and something that feels impossibly like optimism. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, steps from his motorcade. He is dressed in his military best. His wife, Sophie, sits beside him. He is proud. She is radiant. They are, by all accounts, deeply in love, a rare thing among European royalty, who so often married for politics and not for passion. Neither of them knows that 6 young men are waiting for them along the route. 6 young men with pistols and grenades. 6 young men who believe, with burning certainty, that their act of violence today will set their people free. Within hours, Franz Ferdinand and Sophie will be dead. Within 5 weeks, the largest war the world had ever known will have begun. Within 4 years, over 17 million human beings will be gone. To understand how a single assassination in a city most Europeans couldn't find on a map could ignite a world war, you need to understand just how combustible Europe already was. For decades, the continent had been quietly, methodically building toward catastrophe, not out of madness, out of logic, each nation doing what made perfect sense to them individually, and what was creating collectively a trap no one would be able to escape. By 1914, Europe had divided itself into 2 great armed camps. On one side, the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, bound by treaty to defend one another. On the other, the Triple Entente, France, Russia, and Britain, united by overlapping agreements and a shared wariness of German power. The logic behind these alliances seemed sound. If everyone knew that attacking one nation meant fighting all of its allies, no one would dare start a war. Mutual assured deterrence. It was the 19th century's version of a nuclear standoff. But mutual deterrence only works when everyone stays rational. When someone fires the first shot, those same alliances don't prevent war. They guarantee it. Every nation drags every other into the fire, like dominoes designed to fall. Underneath the alliance system, something more emotional was building. Nationalism, the fierce, sometimes fanatical pride in one's ethnic identity and homeland, was sweeping across Europe like a fever. In Germany, there was a growing hunger for what they called a place in the sun, a global empire to rival Britain's. In France, there was still burning resentment over the humiliating defeat to Prussia in 1871, when Germany had taken the industrial regions of Alsace and Lorraine. In the Balkans, that fractious, multi-ethnic peninsula the great powers called the powder keg of Europe, Slavic peoples under Austro-Hungarian rule dreamed of their own nations. One group, the Young Bosnia movement, was particularly dangerous. They were young. They were passionate. They were willing to die for their cause. And they had connections to a secret society in neighboring Serbia called the Black Hand, a group of military officers who believed the assassin's bullet was a legitimate tool of nation-building. Meanwhile, Europe's great powers were locked in an arms race of terrifying scale. Germany had built the second-largest navy in the world, a direct challenge to Britain, whose entire identity as an empire rested on its command of the seas. Britain responded by building bigger, faster battleships. Germany built more. Britain built more still. On land, every major power had implemented mass conscription. France could field over 1 million men. Germany more. Russia, in theory, could mobilize the largest army in the world. Military planning had become extraordinarily detailed and extraordinarily rigid. Germany's Schlieffen Plan called for a lightning strike through neutral Belgium to knock France out of the war before Russia could mobilize in the east. Every nation had a script, and once the play began, no one knew how to stop it mid-performance. The generals had planned for war. The politicians had structured for war. The newspapers had been stoking populations toward war. All it needed was a spark. The plan, from the beginning, was poorly organized. Gavrilo Princip and his 5 co-conspirators had stationed themselves at various points along the Appell Quay. They were armed with grenades and FN Model 1910 pistols. Supplied, intelligence would later suggest, by Serbian military intelligence. They were 19 and 20 years old, most of them students, idealists. Some had tuberculosis. Several had been given cyanide capsules to swallow after the act. At 10:10 in the morning, the motorcade passed the first conspirator. He froze. The moment slipped by. The second did nothing. The third, a young man named Nedeljko Kabranovic, summoned his courage and threw his grenade at the Archduke's car. It bounced off the folded-back convertible roof and exploded under the following car. 2 officers were wounded. Franz Ferdinand's car accelerated out of the danger zone. Kabranovic swallowed his cyanide and jumped into the Miljacka River. The cyanide was old. It didn't work. The river was only 4 inches deep. He was dragged out, beaten by the crowd, and arrested. The assassination attempt had failed. The remaining conspirators, convinced the mission was over, began to drift away. Gavrilo Princip, dejected, wandered to Schiller's Delicatessen on Franz Joseph Street, less than 100 meters from the Latin Bridge, to buy something to eat. Meanwhile, Franz Ferdinand, shaken but uninjured, insisted on visiting the officers wounded in the grenade attack at the hospital. His motorcade set off, but no one had properly informed the lead driver of the new route. The driver turned down Franz Joseph Street, the wrong street, then began to reverse. The car stalled. Directly in front of Schiller's Delicatessen. Directly in front of Gavrilo Princip. History, sometimes, is made of coincidences so extraordinary they feel scripted. A wrong turn. A stalled engine. A young man in the right, or wrong, place at the wrong moment. Princip stepped forward. He raised his pistol. He fired twice. The first bullet struck Sophie in the abdomen. The second struck Franz Ferdinand in the jugular vein. Count Franz von Herak, riding in the front seat, later recalled the Archduke's last words, spoken to his dying wife. Sa Pearl, sterbe nicht. Bleibe am Leben für unsere Kinder. Sophie dear, don't die. Stay alive for our children. They were both dead within the hour. Gavrilo Princip was seized by the crowd, beaten savagely, and arrested. He was 19 years old, too young, under Austro-Hungarian law, to be executed. He would die of tuberculosis in an Austrian prison in 1918, just months before the war he triggered would end. The reaction across Europe was swift, but not, initially, apocalyptic. Assassinations happened. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was not universally beloved, even in his own court. Surely, heads of state reasoned, this would blow over. It would not blow over. What followed the assassination was one of the most dramatic failures of diplomacy in human history. 37 days during which a local crisis became a continental catastrophe, and the statesmen of Europe, some trying desperately to prevent war, others actively engineering it, made a series of decisions that none of them fully understood would be irreversible. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia for the assassination, not without reason. Serbian military intelligence had been involved in arming the conspirators. Austria's leaders saw this as an opportunity, not just to punish Serbia, but to crush Serbian nationalism permanently before it tore the empire apart. But Austria couldn't move on Serbia without knowing what Germany would do. And Germany, governed by the militaristic and erratic Kaiser Wilhelm II, gave Austria a fateful promise. Germany would back whatever Austria decided to do. A blank check, historians would later call it. An unconditional guarantee. Austria issued Serbia an ultimatum so deliberately humiliating that it was designed to be rejected. Serbia, to almost everyone's astonishment, accepted nearly every demand and offered to negotiate the rest. It wasn't enough. On July 28th, exactly 1 month after the assassination, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia, the self-declared protector of Slavic peoples, began to mobilize its vast army. Germany demanded Russia stand down. Russia refused. Germany declared war on Russia. France, bound by treaty to Russia, was next in Germany's crosshairs. Germany declared war on France, and then, executing the Schlieffen Plan, invaded neutral Belgium to attack France from the north. Britain had guaranteed Belgian neutrality in a treaty signed in 1839. Britain issued Germany an ultimatum: withdraw from Belgium immediately. Germany refused. Britain declared war. In 5 weeks, from a single gunshot in Sarajevo, the most industrially advanced civilization in human history had declared war on itself. And almost everywhere, people cheered. Almost no one understood what was coming. The politicians who'd built the alliance system thought deterrence would hold. The generals who'd planned the campaigns thought mobility and firepower would win quickly. The young men flooding the recruiting offices thought they were going to the greatest adventure of their generation. They were going to hell. Germany's Schlieffen Plan called for a swift, 6-week campaign, a sweeping arc through Belgium and northern France, capturing Paris, knocking France out of the war before turning east to face Russia. It almost worked. German forces advanced with terrifying speed. They swept through Belgium, burning the university city of Leuven, massacring civilians in Dinant, and drove deep into France. Paris seemed within reach. The French government fled to Bordeaux. The war appeared to be following the script. Then came the Marne. In early September 1914, French and British forces launched a desperate counterattack along the Marne River. The German advance halted, then stopped. Both sides, exhausted and shocked, began to dig in. Literally, they dug trenches. And what began as a temporary defensive measure hardened, over weeks, into something permanent. A line of fortifications stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border. Over 700 kilometers of earthworks, barbed wire, machine gun nests, and artillery positions. This became known as the Western Front, and for the next 4 years, it would barely move. The stalemate on the Western Front was not an accident. It was the inevitable product of a specific technological moment in history, one in which defensive weapons had dramatically outpaced offensive ones. The machine gun was the great equalizer. A single machine gun, properly positioned and supplied with ammunition, could fire 500 rounds a minute. Infantry attacking across open ground, however numerous, however brave, were walking into a storm of metal they could not survive. The math was merciless. Artillery had become so devastating that advancing forces faced a paradox. The shells that were supposed to destroy enemy defenses instead churned the ground into a moonscape of craters and mud that made advancing almost impossible. The wire that was supposed to be cut by the bombardment often wasn't. The machine guns that were supposed to be silenced were simply moved underground, then pushed back up after the barrage lifted. Every offensive plan followed the same tragic formula. Bombard the enemy lines for days or weeks, then send infantry over the top. The infantry would advance. The machine guns would open up. The attack would falter. The attackers would take catastrophic casualties. The defenders would yield some ground, or none at all, and then it would begin again. To describe what the trenches were like, you have to go beyond strategy and politics. You have to try, however imperfectly, to imagine what it felt like to live there. The trenches were a city built underground. A linear city stretching hundreds of miles, home to millions of men who would spend weeks, sometimes months, in their damp, earthy corridors before being rotated out. They were home to unimaginable boredom, punctuated by unimaginable terror. The mud was constant. Belgian and French clay, churned by millions of shells and millions of boots, became something close to liquid. Soldiers fought in it, slept in it, ate in it. It swallowed boots. It swallowed men. In the worst sectors, men drowned in shell craters, unable to pull themselves free. The rats were everywhere. Great bloated creatures, grown fat on what the trenches provided them. Soldiers reported waking to find rats on their faces. They learned to hang their food high. They organized rat hunts with bayonets and clubs. They never won. Lice were universal. Chats, the British called them, and chatting became slang for picking lice from your uniform seams, something soldiers did with the same casual resignation as tying their boots. But worse than the physical misery was the psychological weight of what the trenches asked of a man. Shell shock, what we would today recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, was widespread and poorly understood. Soldiers who had witnessed too much, endured too much, simply stopped being able to function. Some shook uncontrollably. Some lost their speech. Some went completely blank, staring at nothing, unreachable. The army, for much of the war, classified many of these men as cowards or malingerers. Some were court-martialed. A tragic number were executed, shot by their own side, for desertion or cowardice that was, in truth, the complete psychological destruction of a human being. There was also an almost surreal intimacy to trench warfare. Enemy lines were often only 50 to 100 meters apart. Soldiers could hear each other talking, coughing, laughing. The famous 1914 Christmas truce, when British and German soldiers emerged from their trenches on Christmas Day, exchanged cigarettes, played impromptu football, and buried their dead together in no man's land, was possible precisely because the men had been close enough to see each other as human beings. The truce didn't last. The generals on both sides forbade it. The war, with all its machinery, required enemies, not neighbors. And the killing resumed. 2 battles in 1916 have come to define the Western Front. Not because they were the largest, but because they concentrated so much suffering into such small spaces that they became synonymous with the war itself. Verdun, February to December 1916. The Germans launched a massive offensive against the iconic French fortress town, specifically designed not to capture it, but to bleed France white, to kill so many French soldiers that France would collapse. France refused to yield. The battle ground on for 10 months, with both sides feeding men into the furnace. By the end, France and Germany had together suffered nearly 1 million casualties. The front line had moved less than 20 kilometers. The Somme, July to November 1916. The British launched their great offensive, partly to relieve the pressure on Verdun. On the first day, July 1st, 1916, the British Army suffered 57,470 casualties, including nearly 20,000 dead. It remains the single bloodiest day in British military history. By the campaign's end, over 1 million men had been killed or wounded on both sides. The maximum advance, about 12 kilometers. The men who lived through these battles were never quite the same. An entire generation of European men, The most educated, the most physically capable generation yet produced by industrial civilization was being systematically destroyed. And the war was not even close to over. If the Western Front proved one thing, it was that human ingenuity and industrial capacity would be pushed to their absolute limits in the service of killing. Both sides spent the war's middle years searching desperately for some new weapon, some new tactic that would break the stalemate. What they found instead was a series of innovations that made war more terrible without making it decisively shorter. On April 22, 1915, near the Belgian town of Ypres, French and Algerian troops noticed a strange yellow-green cloud drifting toward them from the German lines. Some thought it was a smokescreen. They stayed in position. The cloud reached them. It was chlorine gas. Men who breathed it felt their lungs fill with fluid. They drowned in their own bodies. The lucky ones ran. The unlucky ones couldn't. A 4-mile gap opened in the Allied lines. And for a few crucial hours, there was almost nothing between the Germans and the Channel ports. The Germans, uncertain what they'd unleashed, failed to exploit it. Gas warfare had been introduced to the world. Both sides escalated. Phosgene, mustard gas, which didn't kill quickly but blistered lungs, skin, and eyes, incapacitating thousands for weeks. Soldiers learned to fight in masks that fogged, choked, and overheated in summer. But gas could drift on changing winds. It could sink into shell craters. It could linger for days. The British answer to the machine gun and the wire was the tank, an armored, tracked vehicle that could crush barbed wire, cross trenches, and advance through machine gun fire. The first tanks appeared at the Somme in September 1916. Only 49 of them, many breaking down before they reached the German lines. But the psychological effect was profound. German soldiers who saw them for the first time reported pure terror. Iron monsters that nothing seemed to stop. The tactical effect, however, was limited. Early tanks were slow, unreliable, and easily ditched in mud. It wasn't until 1918, in the Battle of Amiens, that tanks were deployed in the hundreds and used with genuine tactical sophistication. And by then, the war was nearly over anyway. The war was only a decade removed from Kitty Hawk, but aviation transformed from a novelty to a military necessity in a matter of months. Reconnaissance aircraft, flying over enemy lines to observe troop movements and photograph defensive positions, became so valuable that both sides began sending up fighter planes specifically to shoot them down. The fighter pilots became the war's unlikely heroes, the knights of a mechanical age. Men like Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, who scored 80 air combat victories before being killed in 1918. Or the French ace René Fonck, who survived the war with 75 confirmed kills. These were men whose names civilians knew, whose photographs appeared in newspapers, who seemed to fight a clean, chivalric war above the mud. It was a romantic illusion, but in a war that offered almost no romance, it served a purpose. The Western Front was the war's grinding heart, but it was not the war's only theater. The First World War was truly a world war, fought across 6 continents, at sea and in the air, in deserts and jungles and mountain ranges far from the trenches of France. On the Eastern Front, vast armies clashed across the endless plains of Russia and Poland, a war of movement that the Western Front never achieved, but also one of even greater losses. Russia's armies were enormous, but chronically undersupplied. A soldier could wait weeks for a rifle, fighting with his bare hands until the man ahead of him was shot. By 1917, Russia's losses were so catastrophic, estimates run to 2 million dead. And the Tsarist government so discredited by its management of the war that revolution became inevitable. In 1915, The Allies attempted to break the deadlock by attacking the Ottoman Empire, Germany's ally, through the Dardanelles Strait. The campaign at Gallipoli was conceived by Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, as a brilliant flanking move. In execution, it became another catastrophe of coordination, communication, and terrain. Australian and New Zealand troops, the Anzacs, landed at a small cove that would forever bear their name. They were pinned down immediately by Turkish defenders on the cliffs above. The campaign dragged on for 8 months. The Allies suffered over 250,000 casualties. They withdrew, having gained nothing. The peninsula remained Ottoman. But Gallipoli gave Australia and New Zealand something profound, if at terrible cost: a national identity. The baptism of fire that turned colonial subjects into nations with their own history, their own sacrifice, their own reason for pride. Britain's greatest strategic advantage was its navy, the largest in the world. From the war's first days, Britain imposed a naval blockade on Germany, slowly strangling the German economy and, crucially, Germany's food supply. By 1917, Germans on the home front were eating turnips as a staple food. Children were malnourished. The blockade was arguably the war's most decisive single strategic factor. Germany's response was the U-boat, the submarine. Germany declared the waters around Britain a war zone and began sinking any ship, including neutral ships, that might be carrying supplies to Britain. In May 1915, a German submarine sank the British ocean liner RMS Lusitania off the coast of Ireland. Nearly 1,200 people died, including 128 Americans. America was not yet in the war. But the Lusitania was a crack in the dam. President Woodrow Wilson had kept the United States out of the war through 1915 and 1916, winning re-election on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." American public opinion was genuinely divided. Many Americans were of German or Irish ancestry and had no desire to fight for Britain. Others, horrified by German aggression, felt that American ideals demanded a response. Two events in early 1917 pushed America off the fence. First, Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. Any ship in the war zone was fair game. American ships began to be sunk. American sailors began to die. Second, the Zimmermann telegram. British intelligence intercepted and decoded a secret message from German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann to the German ambassador in Mexico. The message proposed that if the United States entered the war, Mexico should join Germany. And in exchange, Germany would help Mexico recover Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. When the telegram was published in American newspapers, the reaction was volcanic. The idea that Germany was plotting to arm Mexico against the United States transformed the war from a European quarrel into a direct threat to American security. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. The effect was not immediate. America had almost no army. It would take over a year to train, equip, and transport a force capable of making a real difference on the Western Front. But the psychological impact was enormous. For the exhausted, bled-dry Allied forces, it was a lifeline, the promise that help, real help, was coming. For Germany, it was a death sentence. If the Germans couldn't win before America arrived in force, they would lose. Germany knew this, and Germany had a plan. In March 1917, one of history's most dramatic dominoes fell. The Russian Revolution toppled Tsar Nicholas II. Russia descended into political chaos. By November, the Bolsheviks under Vladimir Lenin had seized power, and Lenin had one overriding priority: end the war at any cost. In March 1918, Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, surrendering vast territories but achieving peace. Russia was out of the war. For Germany, this was electrifying. 50 divisions, over 1 million soldiers, were freed from the Eastern Front. Germany now outnumbered the Allies on the Western Front. America's forces were still arriving. There was a window, narrow, closing fast, in which Germany could strike a decisive blow and win the war before American manpower tipped the scales. On March 21, 1918, Germany launched Operation Michael, the greatest offensive on the Western Front since 1914. Using new stormtrooper tactics, small, fast-moving units infiltrating Allied lines rather than attacking them head-on. German forces smashed through and advanced faster than anyone had in years. In days, they gained more ground than the Allies had captured in months of sacrifice at the Somme. Panic spread through Allied headquarters. Paris came within range of German guns. Enormous artillery pieces began shelling the French capital. Hundreds of thousands of civilians fled. For a terrible few weeks, it seemed the war might actually be lost. But Germany's gamble was burning men and material at a rate it could not sustain. The stormtrooper units advanced so fast they outran their supply lines. Soldiers, starved by the blockade, stopped to loot Allied food stores. The momentum slowed, and as it slowed, the Allies had time to react. Under the command of French Marshal Ferdinand Foch, appointed the first supreme Allied commander in the war's history, the Allied forces stabilized. American troops were now arriving at the rate of 10,000 men per day. Fresh, well-fed, and filled with the optimism of a nation that hadn't spent 4 years being ground down, they transformed the character of the Allied armies. On August 8, 1918, what German General Erich Ludendorff would call the Black Day of the German Army, the Allies launched the Amiens offensive. Over 500 tanks advanced alongside infantry and cavalry, supported by overwhelming air power. The German lines didn't just bend, they broke. German soldiers surrendered en masse. Some units simply walked off the field. The 100 Days Offensive had begun, the final push that would end the war. Week by week, the German army fell back. The Hindenburg Line, Germany's supposedly impregnable main defensive position, was breached in late September. Ludendorff, the man who had engineered Germany's last great gamble, told the Kaiser in late September, the war was lost. Germany needed an armistice immediately. Germany's empire was collapsing. The Ottoman Empire had signed an armistice in late October. Austria-Hungary, the empire whose heir's death had triggered everything, fell apart days later, dissolving into successor states. Bulgaria had already surrendered. Germany stood alone. Revolution was spreading through German cities. The Kaiser abdicated on November 9th. A republic was proclaimed. And in a railway carriage in the Campine forest, German negotiators sat down with Marshal Foch to discuss terms. At 5 o'clock in the morning of November 11th, 1918, the armistice was signed. The armistice would take effect at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, which meant the guns would still fire for 6 more hours after the peace was agreed. In those final 6 hours, both sides continued fighting. Orders had been given. Artillery had been pre-ranged. Some commanders pushed final offensives, wanting to claim ground before the clock ran out. Historians estimate that more men died on the Western Front on November 11, 1918, after the peace had been signed, than on D-Day in World War II. Then, at 11 a.m., the gun stopped. Soldiers in the trenches described the silence as the most profound thing they had ever experienced. For years of unceasing noise, explosions, artillery, screaming, suddenly replaced by a silence so complete it was almost physical. Men wept. Some cheered. Some just sat quietly, unable to process it. One British soldier, Private Hubert Trotman, wrote simply in his diary, "And the war was over. And we were alive." So many were not. The statistics of the First World War are almost impossible to comprehend. Numbers too large for the human mind to properly grieve. Military dead, approximately 10 million. From every nation involved. German, British, French, Russian, Austrian, Italian, Ottoman, American, Australian, Canadian, Indian, South African, New Zealander. Men from every corner of the world, dead in the mud of France and the plains of Russia and the hills of Gallipoli. Civilian dead, perhaps 7 million more. Killed by bombardment, famine, disease, and the genocidal policies that the chaos of war enabled. Among them, the Armenian genocide, in which the Ottoman Empire systematically killed an estimated 5 million Armenians. And then the Spanish flu. The influenza pandemic that swept the world in 1918 and 1919, carried and spread in part by the movements of millions of soldiers, killed an estimated 50 million people worldwide. More than the war itself. The physical destruction matched the human toll. Entire regions of France and Belgium had been turned to wasteland. Millions of acres that had been farmland, villages, forests, roads, were poisoned by unexploded ordnance and chemical agents. To this day, French and Belgian farmers periodically unearth shells from the First World War. It will take centuries for the soil to be fully clear. In June 1919, the victorious powers gathered at the Palace of Versailles, outside Paris, to write the peace. What emerged was a document that satisfied almost no one and sowed the seeds of a catastrophe even greater than the war just ended. The Treaty of Versailles imposed crushing terms on Germany. The War Guilt Clause, Article 231, forced Germany to accept full responsibility for causing the war. On that basis, Germany was required to pay reparations of 132 billion gold marks, a sum so enormous it would take Germany until 2010 to pay off the final installment. Germany lost 13% of its territory and 10% of its population. It lost its overseas colonies. Its military was reduced to 100,000 men, barely enough to maintain internal order. The Rhineland was occupied. The Saarland was administered by the League of Nations. The German Navy was scuttled. The German reaction was volcanic. Even those Germans who had opposed the Kaiser, who had supported the new republic, who had genuine liberal and democratic values, were stunned by the severity of the terms. They had expected Wilson's 14 points, a framework for a fair and lasting peace based on national self-determination. They received, instead, what they called the diktat. A dictated peace, one-sided and punitive. The man who would most effectively exploit that humiliation was, in 1919, a failed artist and recently discharged corporal living in Munich, a man who had been temporarily blinded by a British gas attack in the war's final weeks, and who lay in a hospital bed when the armistice came, weeping at Germany's defeat. His name was Adolf Hitler. The Versailles Treaty also redrew the map of the world in ways that created new instabilities. The dissolution of the Ottoman Empire created the modern Middle East, with borders drawn by European powers with little regard for ethnic, religious, or tribal realities. Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine. The British Mandate system planted the seeds of conflicts that continue to burn a century later. The dissolution of Austria-Hungary created a patchwork of new nations. Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Poland, whose borders frequently trapped ethnic minorities within hostile states. The demand for national self-determination was selectively applied, It extended to Poles and Czechs, but not to Arabs, not to Africans, not to Asians. The hypocrisy not lost on the colonized peoples of the world, some of whom had sent hundreds of thousands of their own soldiers to fight for empires that denied them basic rights. Wilson's most ambitious dream was the League of Nations, an international body that could resolve disputes peacefully and prevent future wars. It was the blueprint for what would eventually become the United Nations. And in its principles, collective security, peaceful dispute resolution, respect for sovereignty, it was noble. But Wilson returned home to a Senate that refused to ratify the treaty. America, exhausted by the war and suspicious of entangling alliances, retreated into isolationism. The League of Nations was born without its most powerful potential member. Without American commitment, it had no real teeth. No military power to enforce its decisions, no authority that powerful nations felt compelled to respect. When the next crisis came, the League would prove helpless. The dream of collective security would fail at precisely the moment it was most needed. The world that emerged from the First World War was almost unrecognizable from the one that had entered it. For empires had been destroyed: the German, the Austro-Hungarian, the Russian, and the Ottoman. The map of Europe and the Middle East had been redrawn from scratch. The old aristocratic order, the world of kings and emperors and rigid class hierarchies, had been fatally wounded. Democracy, despite its imperfections, was the future most survivors believed in. The war had accelerated social change at breathtaking speed. Women who had worked in factories and driven ambulances and nursed the wounded demanded, and in many countries received, the right to vote. The rigid class system that had sent working-class men to die under aristocratic officers had become impossible to defend with the same certainty. Trade unions grew. Social welfare programs expanded. The world was being renegotiated. And for the peoples of the colonized world, Africans, Indians, Vietnamese, Egyptians, Arabs, the war had revealed the fundamental hypocrisy at the heart of European imperialism. These empires had claimed to be civilizing the world, carrying progress to primitive peoples. Then, they had produced the trenches of the Somme. Soldiers who had fought for their colonizers returned home asking, "If we are fit to die for this empire, are we not fit to govern ourselves?" The independence movements that would reshape the 20th century were born, in large part, from the First World War. They called it the war to end all wars. They meant it. Survivors, statesmen, poets, philosophers, all of them desperate to believe that nothing like this could ever happen again, that humanity, having glimpsed the abyss, would pull back from it permanently. They were wrong. Within 21 years, a second and even more destructive world war would begin, triggered in large part by the resentments, the instabilities, and the broken promises that the first had created. The men who stormed the beaches of Normandy in 1944 were the sons of the men who had crouched in the trenches of the Somme. The Holocaust was made possible, in part, by a political movement that rose to power on the humiliation of Versailles. The First World War did not end war, but it changed war and the world irrevocably. Modern warfare, the kind that can kill thousands in seconds, the kind delivered by missiles and drones, the kind that targets entire civilian populations, has its origins in 1914, the industrialization of mass death. The idea that whole nations, not just armies, were legitimate targets. Modern international institutions, the United Nations, the Geneva Conventions, the concept of war crimes, the idea that nations are accountable to something beyond their own interests, have their origins in the desperate attempt to make sure it never happened again. Modern literature. The poetry of Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, the novels of Erich Maria Remarque, the memoirs of Robert Graves, carries within it an anti-war consciousness that has never fully faded. Owen's Dulce et Decorum Estate, written in the trenches, finished just weeks before his death in November 1918, ends with a phrase in Latin that had adorned schoolroom walls across Britain. It is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. Owen called it the old lie. Every November 11th at 11:00 in the morning, a silence falls across the United Kingdom, across Australia, across Canada, across France, across dozens of nations. 2 minutes in which the noise of ordinary life pauses and the living try, however inadequately, to acknowledge the dead. It is not enough. It can never be enough. But it is something, a reminder that the world we inhabit was purchased at a price so enormous it still staggers comprehension. That the freedoms, the institutions, the borders, the very languages of power we navigate today were shaped, at the cost of 17 million lives, by 4 years of industrialized slaughter between 1914 and 1918. In a field in Belgium, near the town of Ypres, there is a gate. Every evening at 8 p.m., traffic stops. Bugles are raised. The last post sounds. It has sounded every evening since 1928, interrupted only by the German occupation of World War II. Over 54,000 names are engraved on the gate. They are the British and Commonwealth soldiers who died in the Ypres salient and have no known grave. 54,000 men, gone, their bodies absorbed into the earth of a foreign field. And those are just the ones with no grave. This was the war that changed the world. Remember it.